The year is 1868. London, a city of stark contrasts, hums with the relentless energy of progress and the quiet desperation of its overlooked masses. Chapter 1. Miss Alara Tremaine, the price of porcelain. Alara Tremaine, at 20, possessed a beauty as delicate and prized as the Sevres porcelain her mother collected. Her world was one of Mayfair drawing rooms, hushed conversations over Earl Grey, and the rustle of silk gowns. Marriage, she had been taught, was not a union of hearts, but a strategic alliance, a woman's paramount duty and her only respectable career path. Her suitor, Mr. Arthur Ainsworth, was 35, heir to a considerable shipping fortune, and possessed of a stolid respectability that her parents deemed most suitable. Alara, however, harbored a secret world within the confines of her mind. She devoured books smuggled to her by a sympathetic governess, not just the prescribed novels of manners, but treatises on botany, whispered about poetry by female authors, and even, daringly, articles on social reform. Her impending marriage to Arthur felt like the closing of a beautifully illustrated book before she'd even reached the most interesting chapters. "A good match, Alara," her mother, Mrs. Lavinia Tremaine, trilled, adjusting a stray curl on Alara's head. "Mr. Ainsworth will provide for you handsomely. You will want for nothing." "Nothing except my own thoughts," Alara mused silently, her fingers tracing the spine of a hidden copy of John Stuart Mill's The Subjection of Women. Survival, for Alara, was beginning to look like a careful balancing act, maintaining the placid facade expected of her while nurturing the rebellious intellect that thrummed beneath. Her dowry was substantial, her trousseau exquisite, her future seemingly mapped out on a path paved with comfort and constraint. Her survival strategy, still nascent, was to observe. She watched the older married women in her circle, her mother, her aunts, their friends. Some were content, or appeared so, finding fulfillment in managing grand households, raising children, and orchestrating social calendars. Others bore a weariness in their eyes, a subtle resignation that spoke of dreams deferred or extinguished. Aunt Beatrice, her mother's unmarried sister, was an anomaly, considered an eccentric spinster, yet possessing a sharp wit and an unnerving ability to see through societal pretenses. Beatrice lived modestly but independently on a small inheritance, her home filled with books and unruly cats. She was Alara's silent ally. "Marriage is a long conversation, child," Aunt Beatrice had once told her, her gaze keen. "Ensure you choose a partner with whom you can at least bear to speak for 50 years, and if not, ensure you have other, more stimulating, conversations available to you." This, Alara understood, was code for intellectual pursuits, for friendships, for a life of the mind that could exist parallel to the often stifling confines of matrimony. The wedding preparations moved with relentless efficiency. Fittings for gowns that felt like beautiful prisons, discussions of guest lists, the selection of silver patterns. Arthur was polite, if a little distant, his conversations revolving around his business interests and the political climate. He seemed to view Alara as a pleasing acquisition, an ornament to his rising status. He admired her beauty, her accomplishments on the pianoforte, her demure manners. He never once asked her opinion on Mill or her fascination with the wild orchids of Kent. Alara's first act of subtle rebellion, her first conscious step towards survival, was to begin a journal. Not a frivolous diary of social engagements, but a secret ledger of her thoughts, observations, and sketches of the plants she studied. The quill became her confidante, the ink her silent protest. Chapter 2. Mary O'Connell grit and grime miles away. In the teeming, soot-stained warrens of Bethnal Green, Mary O'Connell knew a different kind of survival. At 22, she was already a wife and mother of 2 small children, with another on the way. Her husband, Tom, a dockworker when he could find employment, was a man hardened by labor and quick to temper, especially when drink loosened his tongue and his fists. Mary's world was one of relentless toil. Her small, damp rooms were shared with another family, the air thick with the smells of unwashed bodies, cheap gin, and boiling laundry. Her marriage to Tom had been born not of strategy or romance, but of proximity and a brief, youthful infatuation that had quickly soured under the weight of poverty and his burgeoning resentment. Survival for Mary was a daily, hourly battle. It was stretching a few pennies to buy bread and potatoes, mending threadbare clothes until they were more patch than fabric, coaxing a reluctant fire in a damp grate. It was shielding her children, little Liam and baby Annie, from the worst of Tom's rages and the gnawing hunger that was their constant companion. Her hands were raw from scrubbing floors in wealthier homes. Her back ached perpetually. Yet within Mary, there was a fierce, unyielding core of resilience. She found solace and strength in the community of women around her Mrs. Higgins next door, who would share a cup of weak tea and mind the children for an hour. Young Bess, who worked at the match factory and knew all the local gossip and where to find the cheapest food. "You've a good heart, Mary," Mrs. Higgins would say, her own face a roadmap of hardship. "And strong shoulders. That's what sees us through, girl. Strong shoulders and a bit o' luck." Mary's more was her children. For them, she endured. For them, she found the strength to rise each morning before dawn to face the drudgery and the fear. Her dream, a fragile, almost unspoken hope, was that Liam and Annie might have a life better than hers, a life with more food and less fear. Sometimes, when Tom was out or asleep in a drunken stupor, Mary would sing softly to her children, old Irish lullabies her own mother had sung to her. In those moments, the grim reality of her existence would recede, and she would feel a flicker of something akin to peace. This, too, was survival carving out tiny pockets of humanity in an inhumane world. She knew nothing of John Stuart Mill or the debates raging in Parliament. Her understanding of the subjection of women was written on her own body, in the bruises that sometimes bloomed on her skin, in the constant exhaustion that settled in her bones. Her rebellion was not intellectual, but visceral. It was the fierce determination to keep her children alive and, if possible, to instill in them a spark of hope. One particularly harsh winter, when work for Tom was scarce and the cold bit deep, baby Annie fell ill. The cough racked her tiny frame and her breath came in shallow rasps. The local parish doctor, overworked and dismissive, offered little comfort. Mary sat up night after night, cradling Annie, her heart a cold knot of fear. This was the sharpest edge of her survival, the constant threat of loss, the terrifying fragility of life in the slums. Chapter 3. The intersection of spheres and unlikely Aaron Lara's Aunt Beatrice, for all her eccentricity, was also a woman of surprising practicality and a quiet, deeply felt sense of social responsibility. She was involved with a small charitable organization that provided assistance food, clothing, basic medical supplies to impoverished families in the East End. One crisp autumn afternoon, Beatrice, suffering from a bout of rheumatism, asked Alara for a favor. "My dear, I know it's not your usual milieu, but I need some papers delivered to our little distribution point near Bethnal Green, and a small package of medicinals. My usual volunteer is indisposed. Would you be terribly averse?" Alara, suffocating under a fresh wave of pre-wedding social obligations and Arthur's complacent pronouncements about the natural order of things, seized the opportunity. "Not at all, Aunt. I should be interested." Her mother was aghast. "Bethnal Green, Alara, it's hardly suitable. The smells, the people." "Nonsense, Lavinia," Beatrice retorted. "A little exposure to reality will do the girl good. She'll be in my carriage with John Coachman, perfectly safe." And so Alara, dressed in her plainest gown, which was still finer than anything most Bethnal Green residents had ever owned, found herself jolting over cobbled streets, leaving the perfumed elegance of Mayfair far behind. The transition was jarring. The air grew thick with coal smoke and unfamiliar, unsettling odors. The buildings were grimy, leaning precariously, the streets teeming with a raw, desperate humanity she had only read about. The distribution point was a small, clean but threadbare room in a parish hall. A stern-faced but kind-eyed woman, Mrs. Davies, managed the operations. As Alara handed over the papers and the package, her eyes scanned the room. Women, mostly, their faces etched with worry and weariness, waited patiently for a small parcel of food or a bit of coal. Children with pinched faces and ragged clothes clung to their skirts. It was here, in this stark outpost of need, that Alara's carefully constructed world began to crack. The abstract concepts of poverty and suffering she had encountered in books took on a visceral, undeniable reality. These were not statistics, but people, women like her in their fundamental humanity, yet separated by an almost unimaginable chasm of circumstance. As she was leaving, a young woman with striking, tired blue eyes and a swollen belly approached Mrs. Davies, her voice low and anxious. "Anything today, Mrs. Davies. My little Annie, she's still so poorly." It was Mary O'Connell, Alara paused, unseen by the doorway. She heard Mrs. Davies' sympathetic but regretful tone. "Supplies are low this week, Mary dear, but here's a little extra broth powder. And I'll say a prayer for your Annie." Mary nodded, her gratitude painful to witness. As she turned to leave, her gaze briefly met Alara's. There was no recognition, of course, just a fleeting glance between two women from different universes. But in that instant, Alara saw not an object of pity, but a reflection of a strength she couldn't comprehend. The image of Mary's face, her quiet dignity in the face of such evident hardship, imprinted itself on Alara's mind. The journey back to Mayfair was a silent one. The silks and satins awaiting her, the endless discussions of flower arrangements and seating charts, suddenly seemed frivolous, almost obscene. Aunt Beatrice's words echoed, "A little exposure to reality." This was more than a little. It was a profound, unsettling awakening. Her own survival within her gilded cage suddenly felt like a different, perhaps less noble, struggle than the raw, elemental fight for existence she had just witnessed. The quill in her journal that night scratched with a new urgency, a new bewilderment. How did one reconcile these two Englands, and how did women in either sphere truly survive? Part 2, The Bonds of Matrimony and the Chains of Society, Chapter 4, Mrs. Arthur Ainsworth, The Unseen Threads. The wedding was a grand affair, meticulously orchestrated and widely reported in the society pages. Alara, now Mrs. Arthur Ainsworth, moved through it all with an outward grace that concealed a growing inner turmoil. Arthur was, as expected, a correct and undemanding husband in public. In private, he was preoccupied with his business, expecting his home to run with silent efficiency and his wife to be an elegant, agreeable hostess. The early months of marriage were a lesson in subtle suffocation. Arthur's townhouse was opulent but impersonal. Her days were structured by calls to be made, dinners to be hosted, and the endless, trivial concerns of her new social station. Her intellectual pursuits were relegated to stolen moments, her botanical sketches hidden beneath embroidery patterns. Arthur, when he noticed her reading, would pat her head and say, "A clever little wife I have, but don't muddle your pretty head with things that don't concern you." Survival, Alara quickly learned, involved creating invisible spaces for herself. Her conservatory became a sanctuary, filled with the ferns and exotic blooms she cajoled from indulgent nurserymen. Here, surrounded by living, growing things that responded to her care, she could breathe. Her journal became thicker, its pages filled with pressed flowers, detailed botanical drawings, and increasingly sharp observations on the society around her. She also began to cultivate friendships with women who offered more than just fashion tips and gossip. Lady Anne Finch, a slightly older woman with a wry sense of humor and a shared love of literature, became a confidante. Together, they attended lectures, the few deemed suitable for ladies, visited museums, and held clandestine discussions about the articles they read in progressive journals. These friendships were lifelines, threads of connection in a world designed to isolate women within their domestic spheres. "Men believe us content with bonnets and babies," Lady Anne once remarked, sipping tea in Alara's conservatory. "They forget, or perhaps never knew, that we have minds that hunger too." Aunt Beatrice remained a vital influence. Her Sunday afternoon visits were oases of intellectual stimulation. Beatrice, unburdened by a husband or the need to conform, spoke her mind freely, encouraging Alara's studies and subtly challenging Arthur's more pompous pronouncements. "A woman's mind, Arthur," Beatrice declared one afternoon, much to his discomfort, "is like a well-tended garden. Neglect it, and it becomes overrun with weeds. Cultivate it, and it yields astonishing fruit." Arthur merely harumphed, but Alara saw a flicker of respect or perhaps fear in his eyes. She realized that survival also meant finding allies, however unconventional. The pressure to produce an heir was ever present, unspoken yet palpable. Arthur desired a son to carry on his name and inherit his fortune. Alara, observing the toll childbirth and relentless child rearing took on many women in her circle, the physical exhaustion, the loss of personal autonomy, felt a profound ambivalence. Yet, she knew it was an expectation she could not indefinitely avoid. The more of survival here was to retain a sense of self amidst the biological and societal imperatives. One day, sorting through some of Arthur's old family papers at his request, she stumbled upon a collection of letters written by his grandmother. They were filled with a surprising wit, astute observations about the political climate of her day, and a poignant longing for intellectual engagement. This ancestor, long dead, reached out to Alara across the decades, a kindred spirit. It was a reminder that women had always sought ways to live fully, even within the tightest corsets of expectation. Alara began to see her own struggles not as unique, but as part of a long, often silent, continuum. She started to subtly influence her own household. She insisted on hiring a well-educated governess for any future children, someone who would nurture their minds, not just their manners. She took an active interest in the household accounts, discovering a surprising aptitude for figures, much to Arthur's initial surprise and eventual grudging approval when she identified areas of waste. These were small encroachments into the male domain, tiny assertions of her capability. Her visits to Aunt Beatrice's charitable endeavors also continued, albeit discreetly. She could not forget the face of Mary O'Connell or the grim realities of Bethnal Green. She began to contribute small sums from her personal allowance and anonymously donated books and warm clothing. It was a way of acknowledging the other England, a way of assuaging a growing sense of social conscience that Arthur would have dismissed as sentimental feminine folly. Chapter 5. Mary's Burdens and Small Mercies for Mary O'Connell. Survival remained a far more brutal affair. Baby Annie, against the odds, had pulled through that terrible winter, thanks to Mary's relentless care and perhaps a little of the broth powder Alara had unknowingly helped provide. But life in Bethnal Green offered no respite. Tom's moods grew fouler with unemployment, and his fists found their mark more often. Mary learned to read the signs of his impending rages, to make herself and the children scarce, or to absorb his anger with a stolid, heartbreaking endurance. Her body ached, but her spirit, though battered, refused to break. Her children were her shield and her reason. Liam, now old enough to understand, would often try to protect her, placing his small body between her and Tom, his little face fierce with a premature understanding of injustice. "Don't you hit my ma'am," he'd cry, a tiny David against a Goliath of despair. Mary's survival was woven from a fabric of hard-won pragmatism and fierce maternal love. She took in more laundry, her hands perpetually chapped and bleeding. She learned to haggle fiercely for every potato, every scrap of coal. She found a grim camaraderie with the other women in her tenement, sharing morsels of food, childcare, and whispered advice on how to manage abusive husbands or procure penny dreadful medicines. "You gotta be tough as old boots, Mary, love," Sal, a woman from the floor above whose husband was just as bad, told her. "Let 'em see you cry and they've won." But there were moments of more, even in Mary's blighted existence. The rare occasions when Tom was sober and remorseful, offering a clumsy apology or a shared crust of bread with something approaching tenderness. The sound of her children's laughter when she managed to sneak them a halfpenny sweet. The unexpected kindness of a stranger, a shopkeeper who forgot to charge for a bruised apple, or a clergyman who offered a warm blanket. One day, fleeing Tom's drunken fury, Mary and the children found refuge in a newly opened Ragged School, a charitable institution offering basic education to destitute children. While Liam and Annie were momentarily safe, learning their letters in a crowded, noisy room, Mary found herself talking to one of the volunteer teachers, a gentlewoman named Miss Evans. Miss Evans, unlike some of the more condescending charity workers, listened without judgment as Mary, hesitantly at first, spoke of her life. She didn't offer platitudes, but practical advice where Mary might find a bit of regular charring work in a safer environment, how to access the parish relief with slightly more success. More importantly, she treated Mary with respect, as an individual, not just a case. This encounter was a small turning point. It reminded Mary that not all gentry were oblivious or uncaring. It gave her a sliver of hope that there might be avenues of help, however limited. Survival wasn't just about enduring, it was also about seeking out these faint glimmers of assistance. The more for Mary was also her fierce, albeit often hidden, sense of justice. She saw the inequities around her, the casual cruelty, the indifference of the wealthy. She couldn't articulate it in the language of reformers, but she felt it in her bones. She taught her children to share, to be kind to those even less fortunate, to hold on to their dignity even when hunger gnawed and clothes were ragged. One evening, Tom came home angrier than usual, having lost his meager earnings in a gamble. He raised his hand to Mary, but this time, something snapped. Perhaps it was Miss Evans' quiet respect. Perhaps it was the cumulative weight of years of abuse. Mary didn't cower. She stood her ground, her blue eyes blazing. "No more, Tom," she said, her voice low but firm. "Not in front of the children, no more." Astonished by her uncharacteristic defiance, Tom faltered. He blustered, he threatened, but he did not strike. It was a small victory, a terrifying one, but it was a victory nonetheless. She had found a boundary, a line she would not let him cross. That night, Mary realized that survival sometimes meant fighting back, not with fists, but with the indomitable strength of a spirit pushed too far. Chapter 6. The widening cracks and secret gardens. Alara's life with Arthur settled into a predictable, if unfulfilling, rhythm. She managed his household with an efficiency that surprised him, transforming it from a merely opulent residence into a truly elegant and well-run home. This domain, at least, she could control. Her conservatory flourished, becoming a local marvel among her acquaintances, who saw it as a charming feminine hobby. They did not see the meticulous notes she kept, the cross-referencing with botanical texts, the serious study it represented. The pressure for an heir intensified after 2 years of marriage. Each month that passed without news of a pregnancy brought a fresh wave of societal scrutiny and Arthur's barely concealed disappointment. Alara consulted doctors, endured intrusive examinations and well-meaning but often ludicrous advice. The medical understanding of female fertility was rudimentary, and the blame for childlessness invariably fell upon the wife. "Perhaps you are too intellectual, my dear," one elderly physician suggested. "A woman's mind should be at rest for such matters. More needlepoint, less reading." Alara fumed silently. Survival in this context meant protecting her sanity from such ignorance. She found solace in her books, in her correspondence with Lady Anne, and in her increasingly detailed botanical research. She began to dream of publishing her observations, perhaps under a male pseudonym, as some women writers were forced to do. The quill was no longer just a confidante, but a potential tool for carving out a small space of recognition in a world that sought to render her invisible beyond her decorative and reproductive functions. Her secret charitable work also expanded. Through Aunt Beatrice, she became more involved, not just donating money, but volunteering her time discreetly to help with record-keeping and organizing supplies for the Bethnal Green mission. She wore her plainest clothes, veiled her face, and used a false name, Mrs. Smith. It was a double life, fraught with the risk of discovery and scandal, but it fed a part of her that her Mayfair existence starved. During one such visit, she saw Mary O'Connell again. Mary was thinner, her face etched with a deeper weariness, but her eyes still held that spark of resilience. She was there with her children, Liam now a sturdy boy, Annie a watchful little girl. Alara, as Mrs. Smith, offered Mary a cup of tea and a piece of bread for the children. "Thank you, ma'am," Mary said, her voice raspy. "You're very kind." "Times are hard," Alara murmured, her voice carefully neutral. "They are that," Mary agreed, a shadow of a smile touching her lips. "But we manage, we always do." Their conversation was brief, constrained by the roles they inhabited. But for Alara, it was another powerful reminder of the shared, yet vastly different struggles of womanhood. Mary's "we manage" resonated deeply. It was the unacknowledged anthem of women everywhere. Arthur, meanwhile, grew more preoccupied with his business and his club. He was not unkind, but he was increasingly absent, both physically and emotionally. Their marriage became a polite arrangement, a facade of domestic harmony. Alara found a strange sort of freedom in his neglect. It allowed her more time for her own pursuits, her secret gardens of the mind and spirit. She began to correspond with a noted botanist at Kew Gardens, initially under the guise of seeking advice for her conservatory. Her insightful questions and detailed observations impressed him, and a cautious, scholarly exchange developed. He, of course, assumed Ainsworth. She used her initial to further obscure her gender, was a gentleman amateur. This intellectual validation, even anonymous, was intoxicating. The more for Alara was becoming the pursuit of knowledge for its own sake, the quiet assertion of her intellect in a world that prized female ignorance. Her survival was not about escaping her gilded cage, for that seemed impossible. It was about transforming it, cultivating beauty and meaning within its confines, and secretly forging keys to doors that society insisted should remain locked to her. One afternoon, Lady Anne visited, her expression unusually somber. "There is talk, Alara," she said quietly, of a new bill in Parliament, the Married Women's Property Act. It may not pass or it may be much watered down, but it is a beginning. A woman might one day own her own property, her own earnings. Ilara felt a thrill course through her. It was a distant prospect, a flicker of light in a long tunnel, but it represented hope. Hope that the structures that bound women so tightly might, one day, begin to loosen. Survival was not just about individual endurance. It was also about these collective, incremental shifts, these slow, laborious steps towards a more equitable world. And women like her, with their secret studies and quiet acts of defiance, were, in their own way, contributing to that momentum. Part 3, The Unraveling and the Weaving, a New Chapter 7. Crises and crossroads, the fragile equilibriums that Ilara and Mary had constructed were always vulnerable to the harsh realities of their respective worlds. For Ilara, the crisis came subtly at first, then with alarming speed. Arthur's shipping business, once so robust, faced a series of unexpected losses, a storm that sank 2 valuable cargo ships, a sudden downturn in colonial trade. Arthur, always so confident, became irritable and withdrawn. He began to drink more heavily, his neglect of Ilara morphing into a brusque impatience. The household budget, once generously supplied, was now subject to his anxious scrutiny. "We must economize, Ilara," he snapped one evening, after a terse discussion about household expenses. "These feminine fripperies. Your conservatory, it all costs money." The threat to her sanctuary, her conservatory, felt like a direct assault on her very being. It was more than just a collection of plants. It was her laboratory, her studio, her refuge. This, she realized, was the precariousness of a woman's position. Everything she had, everything she was ultimately dependent on her husband's fortune and goodwill. The Married Women's Property Act, still a distant dream, had never felt more urgent. Her survival now required a new level of cunning. She began to sell some of her rarer botanical specimens discreetly, using the funds to maintain her conservatory and to continue her charitable contributions, now more vital than ever as Arthur's mood soured on any expenditure not directly related to his business. She also intensified her correspondence with the botanist at Kew, Mr. A. Ainsworth, sending him meticulously prepared specimens and detailed papers. His praise was a balm to her increasingly frayed nerves. One day, a letter arrived from Kew, not from her usual correspondent, but from the director himself. Her contact, an elderly gentleman, had passed away, but not before recommending Mr. Ainsworth's remarkable work. The director invited Mr. Ainsworth to Kew to discuss his findings, hinting at the possibility of a more formal association. Ilara stared at the letter, her heart pounding. It was an incredible opportunity, a validation of her years of secret study, but it was addressed to a man. How could she possibly respond? This was a crossroads. To reveal herself risked ridicule, dismissal, perhaps even Arthur's wrath if he ever found out. To remain silent was to let her life's passion wither on the vine. Meanwhile, in Bethnal Green, Mary's life took a devastating turn. Tom, in a drunken brawl at the docks, was fatally injured. He died a few days later, leaving Mary a widow at 26, with 3 children. Young Thomas had been born a year prior, and no means of support. The initial shock gave way to a terrifying uncertainty. As brutal as Tom had been, his sporadic earnings had been the difference between dire poverty and outright starvation. Now there was nothing. The parish relief was a pittance, grudgingly given. The dreaded workhouse loomed, a place of last resort from which few families emerged intact. Survival for Mary became a desperate scramble. She scrubbed more floors, took in laundry until her hands were raw, and sent Liam, barely 8 years old, to sell matches or run errands for a few coppers. The community of women rallied around her, as they always did. Mrs. Higgins shared her meager meals. Sal kept an eye on the younger children while Mary sought work, but their resources were as stretched as hers. One evening, staring at her sleeping children, their faces pale and thin in the flickering candlelight, Mary felt a despair so profound it threatened to engulf her. The more her hopes for her children, her own resilient spirit seemed to be extinguished. Yet, as dawn broke, something in her reasserted itself. She would not let the workhouse claim them. She had survived Tom, she would survive this. She remembered Miss Evans from the ragged school. Swallowing her pride, Mary sought her out. Miss Evans, though unable to offer a permanent solution, arranged for some temporary, better-paying charring work at a small hospital for gentlewomen, a place far from Bethnal Green, requiring a long, wearying walk each day. But it was work and it was a lifeline. "You are a strong woman, Mary," Miss Evans said, pressing a small sum of money into her hand. "Don't let this break you." Mary nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "I won't, ma'am. For their sakes, I won't." Strength, she was learning, was not the absence of fear or despair, but the ability to act in spite of them. Chapter 8. Unmaskings and New Weavings. Alara, after days of agonizing deliberation, made a bold decision. She wrote back to the director of Kew Gardens, explaining that Mr. A. Ainsworth was, in fact, Mrs. Arthur Ainsworth. She confessed her passion for botany, her years of study, and enclosed copies of her most detailed papers, along with exquisite illustrations. She braced herself for rejection, for condescension. To her astonishment, the reply was cautiously positive. The director, a man of some intellectual daring himself, was intrigued. While a formal position for a woman was unheard of, he was impressed by the quality of her work. He invited her to Kew, not for an interview, but for an informal discussion with him and a few senior botanists. The day she went to Kew, Alara felt a mixture of terror and exhilaration. She dressed soberly but elegantly, her portfolio of drawings clutched in her hands. Arthur, absorbed in his financial woes, barely noticed her departure, assuming she was on some feminine errand. The meeting was daunting. A room full of learned men, their expressions ranging from skeptical to curious. But as Alara began to speak, passionately and knowledgeably, about her research, as she unrolled her drawings, a subtle shift occurred. Their skepticism gave way to respect, their curiosity to genuine interest. She answered their technical questions with precision, her years of solitary study having armed her well. She did not get a salaried position. That was too radical a step for the times, but she was offered something almost as valuable: access to Kew's libraries and herbarium, encouragement to continue her research, and the possibility of publishing her findings in the Kew Journal under her own name. It was a crack in the wall, a significant one. Her survival strategy had evolved from concealment to cautious revelation. The more was the dawning realization that her intellect had value beyond her own conservatory, that she could contribute to a wider world of knowledge. When she told Aunt Beatrice, the older woman beamed. "I knew you had it in you, child. The world changes, Alara, not by grand pronouncements, but by women like you, quietly insisting on their worth." Arthur's reaction, when she eventually confessed her hobby had become something more serious, was one of bewilderment. Botany, but that's men's work. Yet, with his own fortunes so precarious, and Alara's newfound connection to the prestigious Kew Gardens lending her an unexpected cachet, he did not forbid it. Perhaps a small part of him was even impressed, or at least saw a potential, albeit unorthodox, social advantage. For Mary, the charring work at the Gentlewomen's Hospital was grueling. The contrast between the quiet, ordered lives of the patients and her own chaotic existence was stark, but it was regular, and the pay, though modest, was enough to keep the wolf from the door. More importantly, it was a safer environment. One of the older patients, a Miss Pringle, took a kindly interest in Mary. She was a retired governess, sharp-witted and observant despite her failing health. She noticed Mary's intelligence, her quiet dignity. "You have a good head on your shoulders, Mary O'Connell," Miss Pringle said one day as Mary was tidying her room. "And a fine hand with the children, I hear." Ever thought of service in a private house? A nursery maid, perhaps? Mary had never considered it. Domestic service was often a trap with long hours and little freedom, but Miss Pringle was well connected. "Not just any house," she continued. "I know of a lady, a Mrs. Ainsworth, who is looking for reliable staff. She is unconventional in a good way, I believe. And she has no children of her own yet, but is preparing a nursery. It might be a step up." The name Ainsworth meant nothing to Mary, but the prospect of a secure position, a roof over her children's heads, and a potentially kind employer was a ray of hope. Miss Pringle promised to write a letter of recommendation. Survival, for Mary, was about seizing such opportunities, however slim. The more was the enduring belief that things could get better, that her efforts were not in vain. She had learned to navigate the treacherous currents of her life with a pragmatism born of necessity, always looking for the next piece of driftwood to cling to. Chapter 9. Converging Paths. Shared strengths. Through Miss Pringle's recommendation, Mary secured an interview with Mrs. Alara Ainsworth. Alara, increasingly confident from her successes at Kew and more assertive in her own household, was indeed looking to staff a nursery, partly in hopeful anticipation, partly as a project to occupy her mind. When Mary was ushered into Alara's morning room, both women felt a flicker of vague recognition. They had encountered each other briefly in vastly different circumstances at the Bethnal Green mission. But neither placed the other immediately. Alara was struck by Mary's tired but intelligent eyes, her neat if threadbare appearance, and the quiet strength in her demeanor. Mary, in turn, was surprised by Mrs. Ainsworth's youth and the unexpectedly kind expression in her eyes. She was not the haughty aristocrat Mary had braced herself for. The interview was straightforward. Alara asked about Mary's experience with children, her reasons for seeking the position. Mary spoke honestly of her widowhood, her children, her need for stable employment. She did not dwell on her hardships, but her resilience shone through. "I understand you have 3 children, Mrs. O'Connell," Alara said gently. "It is unusual, but I might be prepared to offer accommodation for them on the premises if you are suitable for the position. I believe a mother works best when she is not separated from her own." This was almost unheard of. Mary stared at Alara, speechless for a moment. To have her children with her, safe and provided for, it was more than she had dared to hope. Alara, remembering the faces of the women in Bethnal Green, remembering her own feelings of confinement and her desire for meaningful work, felt a sense of empathy. She saw in Mary not just a potential employee, but another woman navigating a difficult world. Mary was hired as head nursery maid, with her children given small, clean rooms in the attic. The transition was immense. From the squalor of Bethnal Green to the orderly comfort of a Mayfair townhouse. Liam and Annie and little Thomas were wide-eyed at the space, the cleanliness, the regular meals. For Mary, it was a reprieve, a chance to breathe. The work was still demanding, but it was in a safe, respectful environment. She quickly proved herself capable, kind, and fiercely devoted to the as yet unoccupied nursery, keeping it pristine and ready. Alara, observing Mary, saw the daily realities of motherhood, the unwavering dedication, the quiet sacrifices. She learned more about the practicalities of child rearing from Mary in a few weeks than she had from all the advice books and society matrons. A subtle bond began to form between the two women, across the still significant divide of class and circumstance. Alara would often visit the nursery, ostensibly to inspect it, but really to talk with Mary. She found Mary's common sense and quiet wisdom refreshing. Mary, in turn, began to see Mrs. Ainsworth not just as an employer, but as a woman with her own, albeit different, burdens and aspirations. She noticed the books on botany, the sketches, the way Mrs. Ainsworth's eyes lit up when she spoke of her work at Kew. One afternoon, Alara was in the nursery, looking wistfully at the empty cradle. "It is a strange thing, Mary," she said softly, "to prepare so much for someone who may never arrive." Mary, polishing a wooden rocking horse, paused. "Children come in their own time, ma'am, or sometimes they don't, but there's always young ones needing care, yours or others." She thought of her own, now safe and fed, thanks to this woman's unusual kindness. It was in these quiet conversations that the more of their survival began to intertwine. They were from different worlds, their struggles vastly different in scale and scope. Yet they found common ground in their shared womanhood, in their resilience, in their capacity for empathy. Alara learned from Mary's practical strength. Mary was inspired by Alara's quiet pursuit of her intellectual passions. Alara's work at Kew continued to flourish. She published her first paper, Observations on the Orchidee of Kent, under her own name, Mrs. E. Ainsworth. It caused a small stir, a mixture of admiration and tut-tutting in scientific and social circles. Arthur, his business slowly recovering, seemed to take a grudging pride in his wife's unusual accomplishment, especially when a prominent peer mentioned it favorably at his club. Survival, for both women, was no longer just about individual endurance. It was about connection, about finding strength in unexpected places, about redefining the boundaries of their lives. The gilded cage had not vanished for Alara, nor had the memories of hardship for Mary. But within their respective spheres, and now in the spaces where their lives touched, they were weaving new patterns of existence, more resilient and more hopeful than before. Part 4, Legacies and New Dawns, Chapter 10, The Echo of the Quill, The Strength of the Hand Years Past. The late Victorian era was giving way to the Edwardian, a time of subtle but significant shifts. The rumblings for women's suffrage grew louder, the The Married Women's Property Acts had granted women more control over their own assets, and opportunities, though still limited, were slowly expanding. Alara Ainsworth never had children of her own. The nursery she had so carefully prepared eventually became an extension of her botanical laboratory, filled with seedlings, microscopes, and meticulously catalogued specimens. Arthur, though initially disappointed, had come to accept, and even respect, his wife's unorthodox path. Her reputation as a serious botanist had grown, her contributions to Kew highly valued. She published several more papers and a well-regarded monograph on British ferns. Her gilded cage had, in essence, become her research institute, funded by a now-recovered Ainsworth fortune, which Arthur, with a newfound appreciation for his wife's acumen, she had helped him navigate some complex financial decisions with her sharp mind, increasingly entrusted to her management. Her survival had been a testament to intellectual perseverance, strategic adaptation, and the courage to claim her own voice. The more was the legacy she was building not of heirs, but of knowledge. She became a quiet mentor to other young women interested in science, using her influence at Kew to create small openings for them, discreetly funding scholarships. Mary O'Connell remained in Alara's employ for many years, eventually becoming the housekeeper of the Ainsworth residence. Her children thrived. Liam, bright and hardworking, was apprenticed to a respectable trade with Alara's help. Annie, showing a keen intelligence, was educated alongside the children of some of Alara's more progressive friends, eventually becoming a teacher herself at a school for girls. Young Thomas, a sturdy and kind boy, found work on a farm in Kent, introduced by Alara through her botanical excursions. Mary's survival, born of raw grit and maternal devotion, had blossomed into a life of security and dignity. The more for her was seeing her children escape the cycle of poverty that had ensnared her own youth. She never forgot the harshness of Bethnal Green, and she often accompanied Alara, no longer in disguise, on her visits to the charitable missions, offering practical advice and a comforting presence to women still struggling as she once had. Her hands, though still bearing the marks of earlier toil, were now skilled in managing a grand household, her mind sharp in overseeing its smooth operation. Aunt Beatrice lived to a ripe old age, delighting in Alara's achievements and Mary's quiet triumphs. "You see, Alara," she said one afternoon, watching Mary efficiently direct the household staff, "survival is not just about enduring. It's about finding your footing and then helping others find theirs. Some do it with a quill, others with a well-scrubbed floor. Both have their honor." The friendship between Alara and Mary deepened over the years, evolving into a unique bond of mutual respect and affection that transcended the societal barriers of class. They had witnessed each other's struggles, celebrated each other's victories, and learned from each other's strengths. Alara admired Mary's unyielding pragmatism and immense capacity for love. Mary respected Alara's intellectual courage and quiet determination. One day, Alara found Mary in the old nursery, now Alara's study, looking at a framed photograph of her 3 grown children. "They've done well, Mary," Alara said softly. Mary turned, her eyes shining. "They have, ma'am, thanks to you in no small part." "And thanks to you, Mary," Alara replied. "You taught me a great deal about resilience, about what truly matters." Later that week, Alara was invited to give a lecture at a women's college, a new and somewhat controversial institution. Her topic, the role of women in the natural sciences. As she stood before the eager faces of young women, poised on the brink of new possibilities, she thought of her own journey. She spoke not just of botany, but of the importance of intellectual curiosity, of perseverance, of finding one's passion and pursuing it, despite societal constraints. She remembered the young Alara Tremaine, fearful of a marriage that seemed a beautiful prison. She thought of Mary O'Connell, battling for her children's survival in the slums. And she realized that their stories, though vastly different, were part of the same tapestry, the enduring, multifaceted story of how women survived, and more than survived, in a world not built for them. They did it through intellect, through resilience, through community, through quiet acts of rebellion and courage, through nurturing secret gardens of the mind and spirit, and through extending a hand to one another across the divides. The corset of societal expectation might have been tight, often suffocating, but within its confines, women like Alara and Mary had found ways to breathe, to grow, to create, and to leave their indelible mark. The echo of Ilara's quill, penning scientific truths and the strength of Mary's hand, building a safe haven for her family, resonated through the changing times, testaments to the unquenchable spirit of women who not only endured Victorian marriage and more, but who ultimately helped to reshape the world around them. They survived by adapting, by resisting, by creating, and by remembering always that even in the darkest rooms, a single candle or a single determined woman could illuminate the way forward. Their legacy was not just in their individual achievements, but in the collective strength they embodied and passed on, a quiet revolution fought not on battlefields, but in drawing rooms, kitchens, nurseries, and the fertile grounds of the human heart and mind. Part 5, The Shifting Landscape, Chapter 11. Echoes of war and the new century, the dawn of the 20th century arrived not with a gentle sunrise, but with the distant thunder of the Boer War. The jingoistic fervor that swept through Britain touched even the Ainsworth household, though in different ways. Arthur, whose health had begun a slow, inexorable decline marked by a persistent cough and increasing frailty, followed the news with patriotic zeal, lamenting his inability to contribute more directly. His shipping interests, now largely managed with Ilara's surprisingly astute input, profited from wartime contracts, a fact that sat uneasily with Ilara's more reflective nature. Ilara, now in her early 50s, her auburn hair threaded with distinguished silver, found herself increasingly responsible for not just the household and her botanical research, but also for the Ainsworth business affairs. Arthur, often confined to his rooms, deferred more and more to her judgment. "You have a clearer head for figures than I ever did, my dear," he'd admit, a touch of wonder still in his voice after all these years. Her survival had become a quiet stewardship, her more the unexpected competence she discovered in navigating the male-dominated world of commerce, using the profits to further her scientific endeavors and her discreet philanthropies. She read the war reports with a heavy heart, seeing not glory but the faces of young men, not unlike Mary's sons, who might be caught in such conflicts. Her work at Kew, her meticulous cataloging of life's intricate forms, felt like an antidote to the senseless destruction of war. She redoubled her efforts, finding solace in the ordered beauty of the plant kingdom. Mary O'Connell, her own hair now mostly gray but her blue eyes as keen as ever, watched the unfolding century with a pragmatist's apprehension. Her children were grown, forging their own paths in this new era. Liam, her eldest, was a skilled carpenter, married with a young daughter, little Grace, who was the apple of Mary's eye. Grace, with her bright, inquisitive nature, reminded Mary of a young Ilara, full of curiosity. Annie, her beloved daughter, was a dedicated teacher at a rapidly expanding board school in a respectable, though not affluent, part of London. She poured her energy into her students, particularly the girls, instilling in them a sense of their own potential, a quiet echo of the support she herself had received. Thomas, the youngest, worked contentedly on the Kentish farm, his letters home filled with news of harvests and livestock, a world away from the grime of his Bethnal Green infancy. Annie, however, faced her own set of challenges. The education system, while expanding, was still rife with inequalities. Female teachers were paid less than their male counterparts for the same work, and their opportunities for advancement were severely limited. Class sizes were enormous, resources scarce. Annie often came home to the small, neat lodgings she shared with another teacher, exhausted but resolute. "It's a battle every day, Mother," Annie would confide in Mary during her Sunday visits to the Ainsworth house, where Mary still presided as the respected housekeeper. To get them to see beyond domestic service or factory work, to make them believe their minds are worth cultivating. "You're doing good work, child," Mary would say, her hand resting on Annie's, just like Mrs. Ainsworth in her way, chipping away at the stone. Mary understood this chipping away. Her own life had been a testament to it. Her more was now reflected in her children's lives, in their ability to strive for more than she ever could. She took immense pride in Annie's dedication, seeing in her daughter a blend of her own resilience and Ilara's intellectual spirit. Little Grace often visited her grandmother at the Ainsworth house. Ilara, who had a soft spot for the child, would sometimes take her to the conservatory, now a veritable museum of living plants, and explain the names and origins of the exotic blooms. Grace, wide-eyed, would listen intently, her small hand often reaching out to gently touch a leaf or petal. "She has the touch, ma'am," Mary observed to Alara one afternoon, watching Grace carefully examine a fern frond with a miniature magnifying glass Alara had given her. "A curiosity." "Indeed, Mary," Alara smiled. "Perhaps there's a future botanist there." It was a fleeting thought, but it planted a seed. Alara began to think more concertedly about how to encourage young girls like Grace, how to smooth the path that had been so arduous for her. The Boer War eventually ended, but its echoes lingered. Arthur's health deteriorated further. He became more dependent on Alara, not just for business matters, but for his daily care. There was a strange tenderness that grew between them in these twilight years of their marriage, a quiet companionship forged in the shared reality of his decline. He spoke little of his past regrets, but his eyes often followed Alara with a look of mingled gratitude and a dawning understanding of the remarkable woman he had married, whose depths he had only begun to appreciate far too late. Survival for Alara now included the compassionate tending of a life that had once constrained her own. Chapter 12. The suffrage question and quiet salons. The new century brought with it a renewed and increasingly vocal demand for women's suffrage. The movement, once a fringe concern of intellectuals and radical reformers, was gaining momentum, its tactics becoming bolder, its voices louder. Alara Ainsworth, a respected figure in scientific circles and a woman of quiet influence, found herself approached by various suffrage societies. She was sympathetic, of course. Her own life was a testament to the limitations placed upon women. The frustration of having her early work dismissed or needing to publish anonymously, the condescension she had faced, the legal and economic constraints she had navigated, all these fueled her belief in the necessity of the vote. However, Alara was, by nature and by social standing, a gradualist. The increasingly militant tactics of some factions, the window smashing, the heckling of politicians, the hunger strikes, made her uneasy. She believed in reasoned argument, in education, in the slow, steady pressure of intellectual persuasion. "One cannot force a door that is triple locked," Aunt Beatrice used to say, Alara mused to Mary one afternoon as they sorted through linens. "One must find the key or patiently file it down." Mary, whose understanding of politics was forged in the crucible of poverty and injustice, had a more visceral sympathy for direct action. "Sometimes, ma'am," she said, her hands deftly folding a sheet, "a good, loud knock is the only way to get them to even notice you're at the door. When you're starving, you don't always have time for patient filing." Despite her reservations about militancy, Alara found her own ways to contribute. She opened her Mayfair home for salons, gatherings of intelligent, engaged women, and a few sympathetic men to discuss not just suffrage, but literature, science, social reform, and art. These evenings were a continuation of the intellectual nourishment she had always sought, now shared with a wider circle. Lady Anne Finch, her old friend, was a regular attendee, her wit as sharp as ever. Younger women, aspiring writers, artists, and social workers, also found their way to Alara's drawing room, eager for mentorship and stimulating conversation. Annie O'Connell often attended these salons with her mother. Initially shy amidst the well-dressed, articulate women, Annie soon found her voice, her practical experiences as a teacher in a working-class school offering a vital counterpoint to some of the more theoretical discussions. She spoke passionately about the need for educational reform, for better opportunities for girls from all backgrounds. Her contributions were valued, her quiet intensity earning her respect. Alara, watching Annie, felt a surge of pride. Here was the embodiment of the more they had both striven for, a young woman, educated and articulate, bridging the gap between the drawing rooms of Mayfair and the realities of working-class London. Mary, too, played a role, albeit a more behind-the-scenes one. She managed the hospitality for these salons with her usual quiet efficiency, but more than that, she listened. She absorbed the arguments, the debates, the passionate calls for change, and sometimes, in her own way, she contributed. She knew the organizers of local women's trade unions, the women who ran soup kitchens and cooperatives in the poorer districts. She could connect Alara's well-meaning philanthropists with those who had on-the-ground knowledge of where help was most needed. "Mrs. Ainsworth, ma'am," Mary might say, "that Mrs. Pankhurst you were talking about, her people, are holding a rally down in the East End. My cousin's girl is going. Says they need more sensible older women to lend a bit of support, keep things from getting too rough. Ilara, though still hesitant about rallies, began to understand that the fight for equality required many different approaches. Her salons were one form of activism, providing a space for intellectual ferment and networking. The street corner speeches and protest marches were another. And perhaps, she mused, they were not so different from her meticulous work in the conservatory. Both were about cultivating change, one seed, one voice, one carefully argued point at a time. Her more was evolving. It was no longer just about personal intellectual fulfillment, but about fostering a community of like-minded women, about contributing in her own measured way to the broader movement for social justice. She established a small, private fund to provide grants for women pursuing scientific education or independent research, a direct legacy of her own struggles and triumphs. The first recipient was a bright young student Annie had recommended, a girl from a background not unlike Annie's own. The suffrage question was a constant undercurrent. A rising tide, and Ilara Ainsworth, the quiet botanist, found herself, step by careful step, being drawn further into its currents. Chapter 13, A Granddaughter's Hope, A Grandson's Path. Liam O'Connell, Mary's eldest son, was a steady, reliable man, his carpentry business providing a comfortable, if modest, living for his wife, Sarah, and their daughter, Grace. Grace, now a bright 7-year-old, was a frequent and welcome visitor to the Ainsworth house. She adored her grandmother, Mary, and was fascinated by Mrs. Ainsworth's plant palace, as she called the conservatory. Ilara found a unique joy in Grace's company. The child's untainted curiosity and straightforward observations were a refreshing change from the often guarded conversations of adult society. Grace showed an early aptitude for drawing. Her sketches of flowers and leaves, though childish, possessed a surprising accuracy that delighted Ilara. "She has your eye for detail, Mrs. Ainsworth," Mary remarked, watching Grace painstakingly copy a passion flower from one of Ilara's botanical plates. "Perhaps she does, Mary," Ilara replied, a thoughtful expression on her face. "We must nurture that." Nurturing Grace's potential became a quiet project for both women. Mary ensured Grace had paper and pencils and praised her efforts warmly. Ilara provided access to her books and specimens, patiently answering Grace's endless questions, explaining the principles of plant structure and classification in simple terms. She saw in Grace a chance to pass on her passion, unhindered by the societal barriers she herself had faced. This, Ilara felt, was a tangible way to invest in the future, a living legacy. Annie, too, took a keen interest in her niece. As a teacher, she understood the importance of early encouragement. She brought Grace age-appropriate books on nature and science and took her on educational outings to museums and parks. "She has a quick mind, that one," Annie told Ilara. "She soaks up knowledge like a sponge. If she were a boy, they'd be talking about scholarships already." The unspoken implication hung in the air. Even in the new century, opportunities for girls, particularly those from working-class backgrounds, were still limited. Ilara felt a familiar stirring of indignation, a resolve to do what she could to change that, at least for this one bright child. Meanwhile, Thomas, Mary's youngest, continued to thrive on the farm in Kent. He had a natural affinity for the land and for animals, and his letters home, though simply written, painted a vivid picture of rural life. He married a local farmer's daughter, a strong, capable young woman named Elsie, and soon they were expecting their first child. When news came that Elsie had given birth to a healthy baby boy named Daniel, Mary was overjoyed. A grandson, it felt like a completion of a cycle. Her children were settled, building their own families, their lives far removed from the hardships of her own youth. Ilara, seeing Mary's quiet joy, shared in her happiness. The Ainsworth house, though childless in its main branch, was nevertheless touched by the rhythms of family, by the hopes and anxieties that came with new generations. The contrast between Grace's potential path, urban, intellectual, perhaps even scientific if Ilara had her way, and Daniel's rural, agricultural, tied to the land, was stark. Yet both represented a form of progress, a step forward from the grinding poverty Mary had known. Ilara began to think more strategically about her philanthropic efforts. Her small fund for women in science was a start, but she envisioned something more substantial, something that could provide sustained support for girls like Grace, regardless of their social standing. Arthur's declining health meant that the management of the Ainsworth fortune would soon fall entirely to her. She resolved to use a significant portion of it to establish a foundation dedicated to promoting education for girls and women, with a particular emphasis on the sciences. This became her new more, a grand project that synthesized her intellectual passions, her social conscience, and her desire to create a lasting legacy. It was a way of ensuring that the quill would continue to write stories of female achievement long after she was gone, and that the corset of societal expectation would continue to loosen for generations to come. Mary, when Alara hesitantly shared her plans, was deeply moved. "That would be a wonderful thing, ma'am," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "To give girls like my Grace, like Annie was, a chance they might never have otherwise. It's a light in a dark room." For Mary, her children's and grandchildren's well-being was the ultimate testament to her own survival. For Alara, creating opportunities for future generations was the culmination of hers. Their paths, once so divergent, had converged in this shared hope for a better future, a future where women's talents would be nurtured and their voices heard, not just in quiet salons or hidden journals, but in the halls of learning and the corridors of power. The shifting landscape of the new century, with all its uncertainties, also held the promise of profound and lasting change, a change they were both, in their own ways, helping to bring about. Part 6, Trials and Transformations, Chapter 14, Losses and Legacies. Arthur Ainsworth's decline, though gradual, reached its inevitable end in the spring of 1905. He passed away peacefully in his sleep, Alara by his side. Their marriage, begun as a societal contract, had evolved into a complex tapestry of shared history, unspoken understandings, and in its final years, a quiet, respectful affection. Alara felt a profound sense of loss, not for a passionate love, perhaps, but for a companion who had, in his own way, eventually come to appreciate the woman she truly was. As a widow, Alara found herself in a position of unprecedented autonomy. The Ainsworth fortune, substantial and well-managed thanks to her increasing involvement, was now entirely under her control. The societal expectations for a grieving widow were clear: a period of quiet seclusion, draped in black, Alara observed. The proprieties, of course, but beneath the somber exterior, her mind was already at work. Her immediate task was to solidify Arthur's legacy, ensuring his business interests were managed or honorably concluded. But her true focus was on her own vision, the foundation for the education of girls and women in science. Now, there were no impediments, no need for cautious negotiation or subtle persuasion. She could act decisively. She convened a board of trustees, including Lady Anne Finch, a respected and reform-minded solicitor, and, to the surprise of some, Annie O'Connell. "Miss O'Connell brings a perspective this board desperately needs," Alara stated firmly when a few eyebrows were raised. "She understands the challenges faced by young women from less privileged backgrounds, and her practical experience in education is invaluable." Annie, initially daunted by the prospect, accepted with a sense of profound responsibility. This was an opportunity to effect real change on a scale she had never imagined. Her mother, Mary, beamed with pride. "You see, Annie girl, your voice matters. Mrs. Ainsworth knows that." The Ainsworth Foundation for Female Scholars quickly took shape. Alara endowed it generously, ensuring its long-term viability. Its mission was clear: to provide scholarships, grants, and mentorship for girls and women pursuing scientific studies, from secondary school through to postgraduate research. She envisioned laboratories, libraries, and a network of support that would demolish the barriers she herself had so painstakingly overcome. This was Alara's more, achieving its grandest expression. Her personal passion for botany had broadened into a systemic effort to cultivate generations of female scientists. Her survival was no longer just about her own intellectual freedom, but about creating a fertile ground for countless others. The conservatory, once her private sanctuary, became a symbol of this larger endeavor, a place where delicate things were nurtured to strength and beauty, ready to be transplanted into the wider world. Mary O'Connell, though her official role in the Ainsworth household remained that of housekeeper, became an unofficial advisor to Alara in matters of practical philanthropy. Her common sense, Her deep understanding of working-class life and her network of contacts in poorer communities helped to ensure that the Foundation's efforts reached those most in need. She vetted applications from girls whose backgrounds might otherwise have been overlooked, her shrewd judgment and compassionate heart proving invaluable. "This one, ma'am," Mary would say, pointing to a particular application. "Her father's a dock worker like Tom was. She wants to study medicine. Got a fire in her belly, this one, and a good head on her shoulders." Alara trusted Mary's instincts implicitly. Their partnership, forged over decades of shared life and mutual respect, now extended into this new, ambitious venture. The loss of Arthur had, in a strange way, cemented their bond, freeing Alara to fully embrace her own path, with Mary as her steadfast companion and confidante. The legacy Alara was building was not just in bricks and mortar, or in scholarship funds. It was in the changing attitudes she fostered, in the opportunities she created, in the quiet revolution she was helping to lead from her Mayfair townhouse. The quill, once a tool for secret thoughts and solitary research, was now signing documents that would change lives, its ink flowing with the power of purpose and the weight of a life lived with intellectual courage. Chapter 15. Annie's stand. Annie O'Connell, now in her early 30s, was a respected if somewhat formidable figure at her board school. Her dedication to her students was unwavering, but her outspokenness on issues of educational inequality and her quiet insistence on teaching girls subjects traditionally reserved for boys like basic science and mathematics often put her at odds with the more conservative elements of the school board and even some of her colleagues. The crisis for Annie came when a new headmaster was appointed, a Mr. Grantham, a man of rigid views and a firm belief in the natural spheres of men and women. He saw Annie's efforts to broaden the girls' curriculum as unsettling and inappropriate. "Miss O'Connell," he said sternly one afternoon, summoning her to his office, "your insistence on teaching these girls advanced arithmetic and rudimentary physics is, frankly, a waste of their time and the school's resources. They need to be proficient in needlework, domestic economy, and perhaps a little light literature to prepare them for their future roles as wives and mothers." Annie, though her heart pounded, stood her ground. "Mr. Grantham," she replied, her voice calm but firm, "many of these girls will not marry or will need to support themselves and their families. And even those who do marry deserve to have their minds cultivated to understand the world around them. Their potential should not be limited by outdated notions of a woman's place." "Outdated notions," Grantham spluttered, his face flushing. "These are the very foundations of a stable society, Miss O'Connell. I must insist you adhere to the prescribed curriculum." The prescribed curriculum, Annie knew, was woefully inadequate for ambitious girls. She had been supplementing it for years, often using her own meager resources to buy books and materials. To be forced to revert would be a betrayal of her students and her own convictions. Word of the conflict spread through the school and the local community. Some parents, particularly those with bright daughters, supported Annie. Others, influenced by traditional views or intimidated by Grantham's authority, sided with the headmaster. Annie found herself increasingly isolated, her position precarious. She confided in her mother and in Alara. Mary was indignant. "The nerve of that man. Trying to tell you what girls can and cannot learn. It's the same old story, Annie, just a different chapter." Alara, too, was angered. She saw in Annie's struggle a reflection of her own early battles. "This is precisely why the Foundation is so important, Annie," she said. "We must challenge these attitudes at every level. You must not back down, but you must also be strategic." Alara offered her support, both moral and practical. She used her influence to speak with members of the school board, arguing for the importance of a broad education for girls. She discreetly provided Annie with resources for her supplementary classes, and even arranged for some of her scientific colleagues to give occasional, informal talks to Annie's older students, sparking their curiosity and showing them what was possible. The turning point came during a school inspection. The inspector, a surprisingly progressive man, was impressed by the engagement and intelligence of Annie's female students, particularly in the very subjects Grantham had tried to suppress. He questioned Grantham sharply about the limitations being placed on the girls' curriculum. Grantham, flustered and unable to adequately defend his position in the face of the inspector's evident approval of Annie's methods, was forced to concede. Annie was allowed to continue her innovative teaching, albeit under closer scrutiny. It was not a total victory, but it was a significant one. Annie's stand had cost her. She faced resentment from Grantham and some colleagues, but it had also solidified her reputation as a courageous and principled educator. Her students adored her, seeing her as a champion. The more for Annie was this fierce advocacy for her girls, this refusal to let their potential be stifled. She was not just teaching them facts and figures, she was teaching them to question, to aspire, and to believe in themselves. Her involvement with the Ainsworth Foundation grew. She became a key figure in identifying promising students and developing educational programs. Her experiences on the front lines of education gave her a unique and invaluable perspective. She was no longer just Mary O'Connell's daughter, the bright girl from Bethnal Green. She was Miss Annie O'Connell, a force to be reckoned with in her own right, a vital link in the chain of women empowering women. Her survival was now intertwined with the survival of her students' dreams. Chapter 16, The Rising Tide. The suffrage movement, in the years leading up to the Great War, became an undeniable force, its methods increasingly bold, its presence inescapable. The Women's Social and Political Union, WSPU, led by the Pankhursts, embraced deeds, not words, and the newspapers were filled with accounts of arrests, imprisonments, and the brutal realities of hunger strikes and force feeding. Alara Ainsworth, while still preferring reasoned discourse, found her sympathies increasingly aligning with the more active suffragists. The intransigence of the government, the dismissive attitudes of many male politicians, eroded her faith in gradualism. The stories Annie brought back from her working-class students' tales of hardship, exploitation, and the desperate need for a political voice also fueled Alara's conviction. "How can they deny us the vote?" Alara declared at one of her salons, her voice uncharacteristically sharp. "When women are managing businesses, running households, educating children, contributing to science and the arts, and bearing the brunt of so many social ills. It is not just an injustice, it is an absurdity." Her salons became more overtly political, platforms for suffrage speakers from various factions. She began to contribute more generously to suffrage funds, including those supporting the families of imprisoned women. Mary O'Connell, too, found herself drawn further into the movement, though her activism remained rooted in her community. She organized local women to attend peaceful demonstrations, her calm presence and practical advice helping to keep spirits up and heads cool amidst the often chaotic scenes. She understood the anger that fueled the militancy, even if she didn't personally participate in window smashing. "When you've been ignored for so long, ma'am," she explained to Alara, "sometimes you have to shout to be heard. And if shouting doesn't work, well," she left the sentence unfinished, but her meaning was clear. The catalyst for more direct involvement for both women came through a young woman named Flora Davies, a former student of Annie's who was now a fiery young organizer for the WSPU. Flora, a scholarship recipient from the Ainsworth Foundation, had gone on to study at a women's college and had returned to London full of passion and a burning desire for change. Flora admired Alara immensely, but also gently challenged her cautious approach. "Mrs. Ainsworth," Flora said during one visit, her eyes blazing with conviction, "your support is invaluable, but the time for polite drawing-room discussions is passing. We need women of your standing to show their public support, to march with us, to demonstrate that this is not just a movement of a few radical young women, but a demand from women of all classes and all ages." Alara was hesitant. Public demonstrations were far outside her comfort zone. The risk of scandal, of public ridicule, was still potent for a woman of her social standing. But Flora's words and the undeniable urgency of the cause resonated deeply. A large, peaceful suffrage procession was planned, a women's coronation procession, to coincide with the coronation of King George V, designed to demonstrate the breadth and respectability of the movement. Flora urged Alara and Annie to participate. Annie, inspired by Flora and her own convictions, readily agreed. "If my students can face down bullies every day," she said, "I can surely walk in a procession for their future." Alara agonized. It felt like a betrayal of her carefully cultivated persona, her quiet dignity. But then she thought of her own struggles, of Aunt Beatrice's rebellious spirit, of the generations of women whose voices had been silenced. She thought of Grace and what kind of world she wanted her to inherit. "Very well, Flora," Alara announced, a new resolve in her voice. "I will march, and Mary, will you join us?" Mary, who had been listening quietly, nodded. "If you're going, ma'am, and Annie girl is going, then I'll be there too. Someone needs to make sure you both have a sensible pair of shoes and a flask of tea." And so, on a bright June day in 1911, Alara Ainsworth, the distinguished botanist, marched alongside Annie O'Connell, the dedicated teacher, and Mary O'Connell, the steadfast housekeeper, in a sea of women demanding the vote. Alara carried a banner for the Women Writers' Suffrage League, her expression serious but determined. She saw other familiar faces in the crowd: Lady Anne, some of her scientific colleagues, women from all walks of life, united in a common purpose. It was a transformative experience. The sheer scale of the demonstration, the collective energy, the sense of solidarity, it was profoundly moving. Alara felt a sense of liberation, a shedding of old constraints. This, too, was survival, the survival of hope, the survival of a collective dream. The more was the power of shared action, the understanding that individual struggles, when joined together, could become an irresistible force for change. The procession did not, of course, immediately win them the vote. The struggle would continue, growing more intense and bitter. But for Alara, Annie, and Mary, it marked a turning point, a public declaration of their commitment to a cause larger than themselves. They had stepped out of their respective spheres, the conservatory, the classroom, the kitchen, and into the broad, sunlit, and often turbulent arena of public life, their individual threads now visibly woven into the larger tapestry of women's history. Part 7, Towards an Unseen Future, Chapter 17, The Weight of Years. The light of experience. The years leading up to 1914 were a strange mixture of frenetic activity and a gathering sense of unease. The suffrage campaign reached a fever pitch, with acts of arson and increasingly violent confrontations. Industrial unrest simmered, and in Ireland, the Home Rule crisis threatened civil war. Across Europe, the drums of a larger, more devastating conflict were beginning to beat, though few truly comprehended the cataclysm that lay ahead. Alara Ainsworth, now in her late 50s, and Mary O'Connell, a few years her senior, watched these developments with the wisdom and weariness of their years. Their friendship, a quiet constant in a rapidly changing world, had deepened into an almost sisterly bond. They had witnessed so much together: personal triumphs and sorrows, societal shifts, the slow, grinding progress of women's emancipation. Alara continued her work with the foundation, her botanical research, and her discreet support for the suffrage cause, though she drew the line at the more extreme forms of militancy. Her salons remained a hub for intellectual exchange, though the topics of conversation grew more somber as the political situation darkened. She felt the weight of her years not as a burden, but as a repository of experience. Her survival had been long and multifaceted. Her more was now about sharing the fruits of that survival: her knowledge, her resources, her unwavering belief in the power of reason and perseverance. Mary, though her active role as housekeeper had lessened with age, Alara had insisted on hiring more help, ensuring Mary had a comfortable and respected position with fewer physical demands, remained the heart of the Ainsworth household. Her common sense, her quiet empathy, and her unfailing pragmatism were anchors for Alara and for Annie. Mary's health, however, began to show the strain of her earlier life of hardship. A persistent rheumatism plagued her, and her once boundless energy had begun to wane. "You need to rest more, Mother," Annie would tell her, concern in her voice. "Nonsense, child," Mary would retort, though her smile was a little weaker. "There's still work to be done, and watching young Grace grow is better than any medicine." Grace, Liam's daughter, was indeed a source of great joy for Mary. The girl, now a bright teenager, was one of the first recipients of a full scholarship from the Ainsworth Foundation, studying science at a prestigious girls' school, her sights set on university. She often visited her grandmother and Aunt Alara, as she had come to call her mind buzzing with new ideas and discoveries. One afternoon, Alara and Mary sat together in the conservatory, a place that had witnessed so many chapters of their lives. The air was warm and fragrant, filled with the scent of orchids and damp earth. "It's a different world now, ma'am, isn't it?" Mary said, her gaze distant. "From when we were girls, all this talk of votes and women flying in aeroplanes and these moving pictures everyone's mad for." Alara nodded, tending to a delicate fern. It is, and yet some things remain stubbornly the same. The fight for true equality is far from over, Mary. She thought of the ongoing resistance to women's suffrage, the persistent inequalities Annie faced in her profession, the societal expectations that still constrained so many women. "But we've made a difference, haven't we?" Mary asked, a quiet pride in her voice. "You with your books and your foundation. Annie with her girls, even me in my own small way raising my children to be decent folk." "Yes, Mary," Alara said, her voice soft. "We have. Every woman who strives, who endures, who speaks her truth makes a difference. It's like a rhizome." She gestured to a complex network of fern roots visible beneath the soil in a glass case. Each individual shoot may seem small, but they are all connected underground, part of a larger, stronger whole, constantly spreading, constantly seeking the light. Their conversation turned to the looming threat of war in Europe. Arthur, with his business interests, had always followed international affairs closely, and Alara had inherited his attentiveness. The news from the continent was increasingly alarming. "I don't like the sound of it, ma'am," Mary said, a frown creasing her brow. "War, it always falls hardest on the ordinary folk. On the women and children left behind." She remembered the stories her own Irish mother told of famine and conflict, the deep, ancestral fear of upheaval. Alara shared her unease. Her scientific mind, attuned to order and interconnectedness, recoiled from the prospect of such widespread, senseless destruction. The more they had fought. For education, suffrage, social justice seemed fragile in the face of such primal forces. Chapter 18, Seeds of Change, Shadows of War. Annie O'Connell, now a seasoned educator and a respected voice on the Ainsworth Foundation's board, continued her tireless work. She saw firsthand the impact of the foundation, as girls from backgrounds like her own were given opportunities their mothers could only have dreamed of. Young Grace was a shining example, excelling in her studies, her letters to Alara and Annie filled with excitement about her experiments in the school laboratory. "She has your mind, Mrs. Ainsworth," Annie said to Alara one day, sharing a particularly insightful essay Grace had written on Marie Curie. "And mother's spirit," Alara smiled. "A formidable combination. She will go far." Liam, Grace's father, watched his daughter's progress with a mixture of pride and bewilderment. His own life was one of skilled hands and honest labor. Grace's world of academic achievement and scientific inquiry was largely foreign to him, but he supported her wholeheartedly, grateful for the opportunities she had. Thomas, Mary's younger son, and his wife Elsie continued to work the farm in Kent, their family growing. Their eldest, Daniel, was a sturdy boy, already showing an aptitude for farming, his connection to the land as deep as his father's. Their lives, though touched by the anxieties of the wider world, remained rooted in the timeless rhythms of nature. The suffrage movement, in a surprising turn, largely suspended its militant activities with the outbreak of war in August 1914. Patriotism surged, and women across the country threw themselves into the war effort, taking on roles previously held by men in factories, on farms, in transport, and in nursing. Alara, though a pacifist at heart, recognized the necessity of supporting the national effort. The Ainsworth townhouse became a hub for organizing charitable initiatives, collecting supplies for soldiers, and supporting families whose men were at the front. Her botanical knowledge even found a wartime application, as she advised on the cultivation of medicinal herbs, such as digitalis and belladonna, which were in short supply. Annie's school, like many others, was disrupted. Male teachers enlisted, and Annie took on even greater responsibilities, her calm leadership a steadying influence on her students and colleagues amidst the fear and uncertainty. Many of her older girls left to work in munitions factories or volunteer as VAD nurses. Mary, despite her age and infirmity, insisted on doing her part. She knitted tirelessly socks, scarves, balaclavas for the soldiers, her gnarled fingers flying with surprising speed. Her practical skills were invaluable in organizing the collection and distribution of comforts for the troops. Her greatest anxiety, however, was for her grandson, Daniel. He was still too young to enlist, but the war showed no signs of ending quickly. The war years were a grim testament to both the destructive capacity of humanity and its extraordinary resilience. Alara and Mary witnessed profound societal changes unfold with breathtaking speed. Women, by their indispensable contributions to the war effort, were proving their capability and their patriotism in ways that could no longer be ignored. The arguments against suffrage began to sound increasingly hollow. "It's a terrible price to pay, ma'am," Mary said one evening as they read the casualty lists in the newspaper, her voice heavy with sorrow. "All these young lives, but perhaps out of all this suffering some good will come for the women. They can't deny us our due after this, can they?" Ilara, looking at the determined faces of the women around her, nurses, factory workers, land girls, felt a flicker of hope amidst the darkness. "I believe you are right, Mary. The world is changing irrevocably, and women will be at the forefront of building whatever comes next." The more they had striven for was being forged in the crucible of war, not in the way they had envisioned, but with a stark and undeniable power. Survival now meant enduring the unendurable, supporting those on the front lines and those on the home front, and holding on to the hope for a future where such sacrifices would lead to a more just and equitable world. The seeds of change, sown over decades of quiet struggle and passionate advocacy, were paradoxically being watered by the tears and blood of a global conflict. Chapter 19, A Quiet Garden, A Lasting Bloom. The Great War ended in November 1918. The relief was immense, but so was the grief. Scarcely a family in Britain was untouched by loss. Earlier that year, in February, the Representation of the People Act had finally granted the vote to women over the age of 30 who met certain property qualifications. It was not full equality, but it was a monumental victory, a testament to decades of struggle. Ilara Ainsworth, now well into her 60s, received the news with a profound sense of quiet satisfaction. She thought of Aunt Beatrice, of Lady Anne, of Flora Davies, and of all the countless women, known and unknown, who had fought for this day. She herself cast her first vote in the general election of December 1918, a simple act imbued with enormous significance. Mary O'Connell, also over 30 and a householder in her own right, Ilara had long ago ensured Mary had formal tenure of her comfortable rooms within the Ainsworth estate, cast her vote as well. She went to the polling station with Annie, a quiet dignity in her bearing. "For all the women who never got the chance," she murmured, as she dropped her ballot into the box. The post-war world was a different landscape. The old certainties were gone, replaced by a yearning for a new and better future, but also by a deep weariness and a sense of disillusionment for many. Ilara dedicated her remaining years to her foundation and her botanical work. The foundation flourished, supporting a new generation of female scientists and scholars, many of whom would go on to make significant contributions in their fields. Grace, Mary's granddaughter, was among them, pursuing postgraduate research in biochemistry, her path smoothed by the very institution her Aunt Ilara had created. Ilara's conservatory remained her sanctuary, a place of peace and timeless beauty. She published her magnum opus, a comprehensive flora of the British Isles, richly illustrated with her own exquisite drawings. It was hailed as a landmark achievement, cementing her reputation as one of the foremost botanists of her time. Her survival, once a quiet act of intellectual defiance, had blossomed into a lasting legacy of knowledge and empowerment. Mary O'Connell lived to see her grandchildren grow, her great-grandchildren born. Her rheumatism worsened, confining her more to her rooms, but her mind remained sharp, her spirit undimmed. Ilara was a constant visitor, their conversations a comfortable tapestry of shared memories and reflections on the changing world. Mary's more was in the lives of her descendants, in their health, their education, their opportunities, all so far removed from the grim realities of her own youth. She had not just survived, she had built a dynasty of resilience. Annie O'Connell became a headmistress, a respected and innovative educator, continuing to champion the cause of girls' education. She never married, dedicating her life to her profession and to her role on the board of the Ainsworth Foundation, ensuring its mission remained true to Ilara's vision. One crisp autumn afternoon, Ilara and Mary sat together in the conservatory. Sunlight streamed through the glass, illuminating the vibrant colors of the orchids and the delicate tracery of the ferns. Mary, frail but serene, held a small, perfectly formed camellia in her trembling hand. "It's been a long road, ma'am," Mary said, her voice a soft whisper. "It has, Mary," Ilara replied, her hand gently covering Mary's. "A long and extraordinary road." They sat in comfortable silence, two women from vastly different beginnings, whose lives had been interwoven for so long, their individual struggles and triumphs shaping a shared history. The corset of Victorian society was long gone, replaced by new freedoms and new challenges. The quill had done its work, and the strong, capable hands had built a legacy. Mary passed away peacefully a few months later, surrounded by her loving family. Ilara felt her loss deeply, like the severing of a vital root, but she also felt an immense gratitude for their long and profound friendship. Ilara herself lived on for several more years, a revered figure in the scientific community, a beloved benefactor to countless young women. She continued to work in her conservatory, her mind as agile as ever, until her own peaceful end. Chapter 20, Epilogue, the unfolding tapestry the years unfolded, carrying the world into new decades, new conflicts, and new advancements. The Ainsworth Foundation for Female Scholars continued its vital work, a beacon of opportunity, adapting to the changing needs of each new generation. Grace O'Connell, Ph.D., became a distinguished biochemist, her research leading to significant medical breakthroughs. She often spoke of her great-aunt Ilara and her grandmother Mary, acknowledging the debt she owed to their courage and vision. She, in turn, mentored young women in science, continuing the cycle of empowerment. The descendants of Mary O'Connell, scattered across various professions and walks of life, carried with them the legacy of her resilience and her unwavering belief in the importance of family and community. Liam's carpentry skills were passed down, Thomas's love for the land found echoes in his children, and Annie's passion for education inspired future teachers in the family. The Ainsworth townhouse, though eventually passing into other hands, retained a faint, lingering scent of exotic blooms from the conservatory, a whisper of the extraordinary woman who had once filled its rooms with books, ideas, and a quiet determination. The struggle for full equality for women continued, evolving with each passing era. New battles were fought, new victories won. But the foundations laid by women like Ilara Tremaine Ainsworth and Mary O'Connell, their insistence on intellectual freedom, their fight for basic human dignity, their unwavering support for one another, remained an integral part of that unfolding tapestry. Their survival was not just a personal triumph, it was a testament to the enduring strength of the female spirit. From the confines of Victorian marriage to the burgeoning freedoms of the 20th century and beyond, they and women like them had not only endured and more, but had actively shaped a world where future generations might breathe more freely, dream more boldly, and achieve more fully. The echoes of the corset had faded, but the vibrant ink of the quill, and the enduring strength of the hand that held it, and the hand that toiled and nurtured, continued to write new, empowering chapters in the ever-evolving story of womanhood. Their lives were a quiet garden, patiently cultivated, whose blooms continued to enrich the world long after they were gone. Part 8, The Torch Past Chapter 21. Dr. Grace O'Connell, A New Frontier. The interwar years were a period of profound social and technological change. For Dr. Grace O'Connell, they marked her ascent in the burgeoning field of biochemistry. Armed with her doctorate, funded in part by the Ainsworth Foundation, she was now increasingly involved with. Grace secured a research position at a prestigious London university. The halls of academia were still overwhelmingly male, and the subtle and sometimes not so subtle condescension she encountered was a familiar echo of what Ilara had faced decades earlier, albeit cloaked in a more modern, collegial guise. Dr. O'Connell, your work on enzyme kinetics is surprisingly meticulous, a senior professor once remarked, his tone implying that meticulousness was an unexpected trait in a female scientist. Grace, channeling the quiet dignity of her grandmother Mary and the intellectual fortitude of her great-aunt Ilara, would simply smile coolly and present her irrefutable data. Her laboratory became her domain, much like Ilara's conservatory had been hers. It was a place of intense focus, of clinking glassware, the hum of centrifuges, and the thrill of discovery. She was driven by a fierce curiosity, a desire to unravel the intricate chemical ballast that underpinned life itself. Her research focused on metabolic pathways, and her early papers, published in respected journals, began to attract attention. Grace was acutely aware of the legacy she carried. She often visited the Ainsworth Foundation's headquarters, now a handsome building in Bloomsbury, its walls adorned with portraits of Ilara Ainsworth, and, in a place of quiet honor, a smaller, warm photograph of Mary O'Connell, whose common-sense wisdom had shaped so much of its early practical outreach. Grace served on the Foundation's Scientific Advisory Board, her insights invaluable in guiding its funding decisions. Aunt Alara believed that science needed women's minds, Grace would tell aspiring young scholars who came to the Foundation for support. Not just for fairness, but because diverse perspectives lead to better science. And my grandmother Mary taught me that resilience and pragmatism can overcome almost any obstacle. Her personal life was a delicate balance. The societal expectation for a woman, even a highly educated one, was still largely centered on marriage and family. Grace had suitors, intelligent and accomplished men, but she was wary of any relationship that might compromise her dedication to her research. She saw how many brilliant female colleagues had their careers sidelined or curtailed by domestic responsibilities. For a time, it seemed her work would be her sole passion. Then she met Dr. Alastair Finch, a physician and medical researcher, grandson of Alara's old friend, Lady Anne Finch. Alastair, himself a product of a family that valued intellectual women, admired Grace's brilliance and her dedication. He saw her not as an anomaly, but as an equal. Their courtship was a meeting of minds as much as hearts, filled with lively debates about scientific ethics, medical advancements, and the state of the world. Their marriage, when it came, was a partnership. Alastair understood the demands of her research and championed her work. They chose not to have children, a decision that raised eyebrows in some quarters, but one they made together, preferring to dedicate their energies to their respective contributions to science and medicine. Grace knew this path was a luxury her grandmother's generation could never have conceived of. Her survival was not about escaping poverty or oppressive social norms in the same way, but about carving out a space for her ambition in a world that still struggled to fully accept it, and defining her more on her own terms, including the choice of a childless, career-focused life. The Foundation, under Alara's initial guidance, and now with the input of women like Annie and Grace, had evolved. It not only provided scholarships, but also funded purpose-built laboratories for women, sponsored lecture series, and actively campaigned for equal opportunities in scientific education and employment. It was a living testament to Alara's foresight. Grace often thought of Alara's metaphor of the rhizome, the interconnected network of roots. She saw herself as one of those shoots, nurtured by the system Alara had established, and now responsible for strengthening and extending that network for others. The challenges were different, no longer the overt legal barriers Alara faced, but the more insidious biases, the old boys club mentality, the systemic undervaluing of women's contributions. But the core struggle for recognition and opportunity remained. Chapter 22, War's Shadow. Science's light, the ominous drumbeat of war grew louder once more in the late 1930s. The rise of fascism in Europe, the appeasement policies, the escalating tensions. Grace and Alastair followed the news with growing dread. When Britain declared war on Germany in September 1939, the world was once again plunged into conflict, a conflict that would be even more total and devastating than the Great War. Grace's biochemical research, once purely academic, suddenly took on a new urgency. Her work on metabolic processes had potential applications in understanding nutrition under rationing, wound healing, and the effects of toxins. The government, recognizing the critical role of scientists, co-opted many university laboratories for war-related research. Grace found herself leading a team working on developing more stable and effective penicillin production methods, a project of immense importance for treating infections in wounded soldiers and civilians. The war years were a period of intense pressure and extraordinary innovation. Long hours in the lab, often punctuated by air raid sirens and the drone of bombers overhead, became the norm. Londoners endured the Blitz with a stoicism that reminded Grace of her grandmother Mary's quiet resilience. Food was rationed, resources scarce, but the scientific community, like the rest of the nation, pulled together with a common purpose. Alastair served as a physician in a busy London hospital, dealing daily with the casualties of the Blitz. Their evenings together were brief, often spent sharing news of their respective efforts, finding solace and strength in each other's presence. The Ainsworth Foundation, too, adapted its mission. While its core focus on supporting female scientists remained, it also directed funds towards war-related medical research and provided support for women taking on new scientific and technical roles in war industries. Annie O'Connell, now retired as a headmistress, but still fiercely active on the Foundation's board, helped organize training programs for women entering factory work, ensuring they had the basic scientific literacy needed for their new roles. Grace's team made significant breakthroughs in penicillin stabilization and purification, contributing to the Allied war effort in a tangible way. It was exhausting, often heartbreaking work, but it was also profoundly meaningful. She saw young women, many of them beneficiaries of Ainsworth grants, working alongside her in the labs, their dedication and skill a testament to Alara's vision. The war, for all its horror, was accelerating social change, further eroding old prejudices about women's capabilities. One of Mary's other descendants, Daniel O'Connell Thomas's son, the farmer from Kent, served in the army, fighting in North Africa and Italy. His letters home to his parents and occasionally to Cousin Grace, as the family ties, though spread out, were still maintained, were filled with the grim realities of war, but also with a sturdy, S Cyrillic letter 456 L Yeri S Yeri Ka E Ikrakui pragmatism. He survived, though not unscathed, carrying the physical and emotional scars of combat. The war also brought personal loss. Lady Anne Finch, Alastair's grandmother and Alara's dear old friend, passed away during the Blitz, her London home damaged by a bomb. Though elderly, her sharp wit and progressive spirit had remained undimmed. Her death felt like the severing of another link to Alara's generation, a reminder of the passage of time and the fragility of life. When the war finally ended in 1945, the world was irrevocably changed. The scale of destruction, the horror of the Holocaust, the dawn of the atomic age, these cast long shadows. But there was also a renewed hope for a better future, a determination to rebuild and to learn from the mistakes of the past. Grace O'Connell emerged from the war a highly respected scientist, her contributions recognized. She returned to her university research, but her perspective had broadened. She was more committed than ever to ensuring that science served humanity and that women played an equal role in shaping its future. The more she sought was not just personal scientific achievement, but a world where knowledge was used for peace and progress, and where the barriers to women's full participation were finally dismantled. The torch passed from Alara, and fanned by the needs of war, now burned brighter in Grace's dedicated hands. Part 9. Echoes in a New Age Chapter 23. The double helix and the second wave the post-war decades brought unprecedented scientific advancement and profound social shifts. The discovery of the structure of DNA in 1953 by Watson and Crick, with the uncredited but crucial contributions of Rosalind Franklin, a contemporary of Grace's who faced immense sexism in her field, ushered in a new era of molecular biology, the very field Grace had helped to pioneer. Dr. Grace O'Connell Finch, as she was now professionally known, watched these developments with a mixture of excitement and a familiar frustration. While she celebrated the breakthroughs, she was keenly aware of how women like Franklin were often marginalized, their contributions overlooked or appropriated. The Ainsworth Foundation redoubled its efforts to support women in these rapidly evolving fields, establishing fellowships specifically for research in genetics and molecular biology, and actively promoting the achievements of female scientists. Grace, now a senior professor and a leading figure in her field, used her platform to advocate for greater recognition and support for women in STEM. She mentored countless young scientists, both male and female, but took a particular interest in guiding the careers of promising women. She remembered Alara's quiet determination and Annie's fierce advocacy and sought to emulate their best qualities. The scientific establishment can be a formidable beast, she would tell her female proteges, but it is not monolithic. Find your allies, do impeccable work, and do not be afraid to claim your space. Aunt Alara did it with botany when it was considered a gentleman's hobby, and the challenges today, while different, require the same courage. The 1960s and 70s saw the rise of the second wave of feminism, a movement that challenged not just legal inequalities, but also ingrained cultural attitudes, gender roles, and societal structures. Issues like reproductive rights, equal pay, and workplace discrimination came to the fore. Grace, then in her 50s and 60s, found herself a somewhat unexpected icon for a new generation of feminists. Her life, a successful scientific career, a partnership marriage, a conscious decision not to have children resonated with many young women who were seeking alternatives to traditional roles. She was invited to speak at conferences, to write articles, to share her experiences. She sometimes felt a generational disconnect with the more radical elements of the movement, much as Alara had with the more militant suffragettes. Grace's approach had always been one of working within existing structures, patiently but persistently pushing for change. But she admired the passion and energy of these young women and recognized the validity of their critiques. "They are impatient, and rightly so," she remarked to Alastair. "We made progress, my generation, but the pace was too slow. They are demanding now what should have been theirs all along." The Ainsworth Foundation, under Grace's increasingly influential guidance, she eventually became its long-serving chair, embraced many of the goals of the second wave. It expanded its remit to include funding for childcare support for female scientists, programs to combat gender bias in academia, and initiatives to encourage girls to pursue STEM subjects from an early age. One of Grace's nieces, Sarah, Liam's granddaughter, Grace's own namesake from a different branch of the O'Connell family tree, became a beneficiary of this new focus. Sarah, a bright young woman in the 1970s, wanted to pursue a career in computer science, then a nascent and heavily male-dominated field. The foundation provided her with a scholarship and, crucially, connected her with a network of female mentors in technology. Sarah often visited Grace, her great-aunt, seeking advice and encouragement. Grace saw in Sarah a spark of the same intellectual curiosity that had driven Alara and herself. "It won't be easy, Sarah," Grace told her. "They'll tell you it's not a field for women. They'll question your abilities. Ignore them. Your mind is your greatest asset. Use it and prove them wrong." Sarah's journey was different from Grace's and vastly different from Alara's. The overt barriers were fewer, but the subtle biases, the cultural expectations, the challenge of balancing ambition with personal life in a still unequal world remained. Her survival was about navigating a complex modern landscape, armed with more opportunities, but also facing new forms of pressure. Her more was about harnessing the power of technology, a field Alara could scarcely have imagined, and ensuring women were not left behind in this new revolution. Chapter 24, The Unending Garden As. The 20th century drew to a close, and the 21st began. Dr. Grace O'Connell Finch, now an emeritus professor, looked back on a life of remarkable achievement and profound change. She had witnessed the dawn of the atomic age, the space race, the digital revolution, and incredible advances in medicine and biology, many of which she had contributed to. She had also seen significant strides in women's rights, though she knew the journey was far from over. The Ainsworth Foundation remained a powerful force, its endowment carefully managed and grown over the decades, its mission constantly adapting to new challenges. It now supported women in a vast array of scientific and technological fields, from astrophysics to artificial intelligence, its reach global. The portraits of Alara Ainsworth and Mary O'Connell still held their places of honor, silent witnesses to the enduring impact of their lives. Grace, in her later years, spent much of her time in the gardens of her country home, a passion she had developed that echoed Alara's love for her conservatory. She cultivated rare plants, corresponded with botanists, and found a deep solace in the rhythms of nature. It was here, amidst the roses and the rhododendrons, that she felt most connected to the legacy of the women who had come before her. She often thought of Alara, the Victorian lady who defied convention to pursue her scientific passion, and her grandmother Mary, the impoverished Irish immigrant who survived against all odds, her fierce love for her children her driving force. Their stories, once private struggles, had become part of a larger narrative of female resilience and empowerment. One sunny afternoon, Sarah, now a successful software engineer and a mother herself, visited Grace with her young daughter, Alara, named, of course, in honor of the family's pioneering ancestor. Little Alara, a bright, inquisitive child with her great-great-great-grandmother's keen eyes, was fascinated by Grace's garden. Why do flowers have so many different colors, Aunt Grace? She asked, her small hand reaching for a vibrant blue delphinium. Grace smiled, her heart warmed by the child's curiosity. She began to explain, in simple terms, the science of pigments, the role of pollinators, the intricate dance of genetics and environment. As she spoke, she saw the unbroken thread stretching back through the generations, from Alara Tremaine sketching orchids in her secret journal, to Mary O'Connell nurturing her children in the slums, to Annie teaching her girls in a crowded classroom, to Grace herself in her laboratory, and now to young Sarah pioneering in the digital world, and little Alara, poised on the brink of her own discoveries. Each woman had faced her own corset, her own set of constraints, whether societal, economic, or cultural. Each had found her own way to survive and to strive for more. Their methods had differed: the quill, the scrubbing brush, the teacher's chalk, the pipette, the keyboard, but their underlying spirit was the same: a refusal to be limited, a determination to learn, to grow, to contribute, and to lift others as they climbed. The Ainsworth Foundation, Alara's most tangible legacy, was like an unending garden, constantly being tended, replanted, and expanded by new generations. Its purpose remained true to her original vision: to cultivate the intellectual potential of women, to remove the barriers that stood in their way, and to ensure that their voices and talents enriched the world. Grace knew that the fight for true equality was not a finite battle to be won, but an ongoing process, a continuous striving. New challenges would always arise, new forms of bias would emerge, but the stories of Alara and Mary and countless women like them provided an enduring source of inspiration and a roadmap for resilience. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the garden, Grace looked at young Alara, her face alight with newfound knowledge. The torch had been passed, and it was burning brightly. The legacy of survival and the pursuit of more was safe in the hands of a new generation, ready to tend the unending garden and make their own mark on the ever-evolving tapestry of women's lives. The quiet revolution, begun in Victorian drawing rooms and cobbled streets, continued, its echoes resonating through the centuries, a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit to overcome, to innovate, and to bloom.